The wire bites into skin before it ever holds weight. It doesn't feel like a rope. It feels like a tool meant to hurt. A body jerks under a hook, legs searching for floor that isn't there, while a camera operator keeps the lens steady because someone higher up wants proof. That image is the claim people repeat. Hitler used piano wire to execute people during World War II, especially after the plot against him. So the question isn't whether Nazis were capable of cruelty. The question is whether piano wire was a real execution method ordered and used the way the story implies. But first, you need to understand the trap. Dictatorships don't choose killing methods for drama. They choose them for control, throughput, and message. Before we dive in, pause for a second. Make a prediction. Was piano wire a real, repeated execution tool inside Hitler's system? Or is it a memorable label attached to a different method that already existed? Keep that answer in your head. By the end, you might change your mind. If you're into history that digs into economics, power, logistics, and human cost instead of just battles, generals, and myths, hit subscribe. To understand why this story stuck, you need to understand the trap of scale. When a state kills in bulk, it stops being personal, it becomes procedural. Here's the baseline belief. After the 20th of July, 1944, Hitler wanted revenge. The People's Court turned trials into humiliation, and the conspirators were executed with piano wire, slowly, like animals, as a warning to everyone in uniform. But that assumption collapses when you follow the constraints. Because piano wire is a one-to-one killing tool. It's intimate, it's manual, it's messy, and it fights your biggest wartime shortage, time. The Nazi state had two killing worlds that get blended into one story. One was the judiciary, courts, sentences, prisons, official executions. The other was the security apparatus, Gestapo, SS custody, camps, disappearances, mass murder, without courtroom paperwork. Piano wire belongs, if anywhere, to the second world. Spy work, clandestine killing, personal terror. So we start where the regime most clearly wanted spectacle, the weeks after the 20th of July. Because Hitler survived, he was forced to turn punishment into theater. He didn't have the option to look calm. This looks like a choice, but it's a constraint. If the dictator looks vulnerable, the whole system invites a second attempt. And because the conspirators were elite officers, the regime was forced to destroy their status, not just their bodies. The math is brutal. A quick death can create martyrs. A humiliating death poisons memory. Now compare that to how the execution system normally works. In the Nazi judicial pipeline, executions were not rare drama, they were routine. Over the life of the regime, the court sentenced many thousands to death, and the state executed them in designated sites with staff who did it again and again. One prison in Berlin, Plötzensee, became a major node. Over 2,500 people were executed there between 1933 and 1945. That number isn't trivia. That's throughput. Because the state needed throughput, they were forced to prefer methods that can be repeated in a fixed room with a fixed team on a fixed schedule. They didn't have the option to build a method around hand-to-hand struggle each time, and that changes everything. If piano wire were truly an institutional method, you would expect it to appear as the standard solution to a scale problem. But scale pushes you toward boring tools, a guillotine, a scaffold, a firing detail, tools that turn killing into procedure. So here's the part people miss. The real story isn't wire. The real story is short drop hanging. A short drop hanging doesn't aim to break the neck quickly. It aims to strangle. It can be prolonged, it can look like a slow collapse, and it can be staged for humiliation, especially if the body is suspended from hooks and the condemned is made to look like meat in a shed. And that method doesn't require piano wire, it requires only a thin cord, a hook, and an order to make it slow. Now anchor this to a specific moment. Early August 1944, Plötzensee. The regime runs a special execution action for conspirators connected to the bomb plot. The important detail is not the brand of cord. The important detail is the design goal. The deaths were meant to be degrading, and they were meant to be documented. Because Hitler wanted a message, they were forced to build an execution scene that looked like absolute domination. And because they wanted the message to travel, they were forced to involve filming and witnesses. That's the system logic. Now, zoom out again, because we still haven't answered the wire question. Where does piano wire come from? It comes from the way stories mutate when they travel. A thin rope becomes wire because wire feels more sadistic. A piano string becomes piano wire because it sounds precise and memorable. A slow hanging becomes a garrote because audiences understand garrotes as deliberate cruelty. And once the phrase exists, it becomes a shortcut for the whole event. But history is allergic to shortcuts. Here's a constraint chain that explains why piano wire is unlikely as a routine state method, even in a revenge moment. Because the regime wanted multiple executions in a tight window, they were forced to use a method that can reset quickly between victims. They didn't have the option to spend long minutes physically strangling each person by hand. Because the regime wanted the deaths to happen inside a controlled facility, they were forced to use equipment already in prison infrastructure: hooks, beams, scaffolds, prepared rooms. Because the regime wanted intimidation, they were forced to make it look humiliating, not necessarily technically exotic. This looks like a choice, but it's a constraint. Humiliation is cheaper than invention. Compare that to a truly piano wire execution, as people imagine it. Picture a guard or executioner wrapping wire around a throat and pulling, needing leverage, needing strength, needing time, risking struggle, leaving bruises that look like a brawl. Now picture a hook and a thin cord. The condemned is hoisted, the body fights, the death is slow. The room stays controlled. The next person can be brought in. That is the difference between a manual murder and an administrative execution. And here's what made it devastating. The second one scaled. The point is whether Hitler's system used slow, humiliating hangings to make a political warning. And on that, the answer is yes. The regime staged executions to degrade conspirators. It used the People's Court to humiliate them first, and it used execution method to erase their dignity second. But if you ask whether actual piano wire specifically was the standard material used, the story gets weaker. The surviving descriptions tend to emphasize thin cord and slow hanging more than a consistent, literal wire implementation. That's not a dodge. That's the system, because the regime didn't need wire to create suffering. It needed process. Now let's do the numbers that do work, because numbers tell you what the system cared about. Plötzensee executed over 2,500 people across the regime. That means the facility's purpose was repetition, not novelty. And across the Nazi judicial apparatus, executions reached into the many thousands. That means the state's execution methods had to be trainable, repeatable, and schedule-friendly. The math is brutal. A method that requires specialized materials, specialized technique, or high variability is a bottleneck. And bottlenecks are where systems fail. So when the regime wanted cruelty, it didn't invent a new process. It weaponized an existing one. That's the trade-off. Now layer an opportunity cost, because dictatorships face it too. If you spend prison staff time and security bandwidth on elaborate one-off theatrical killing, you don't get routine throughput. And routine throughput is what actually wins the war you're fighting inside your own population. And if you spend propaganda effort on private revenge footage meant for insiders, you don't get mass persuasion that stabilizes the home front. And mass persuasion is what actually wins the war you're fighting when your cities are burning. That's why spectacle shows up in bursts tied to moments of panic. Once that happens, the next problem is control of the officer corps, because the bomb plot proves something terrifying. The army is not a single loyal bloc. It has factions, it has doubts, it has men who can imagine a Germany without Hitler. That forces the regime to punish not just traitors, but the idea of traitors. And then the timeline collapses inside the regime's own head. Every rumor becomes a threat. Every private conversation becomes a potential conspiracy. The Gestapo's workload explodes, and fear becomes the governing fuel. And fear is expensive. It consumes manpower, it consumes trust, it consumes competence, because the smart people learn to stay silent. So, when Hitler orders humiliation, he is not only killing enemies, he is signaling to everyone still alive, you are trapped. And that is why the method mattered, not because wire is special, because the scene is special. Now zoom out to the larger killing landscape of Nazi Germany, because it answers the question in a different way. Most Nazi killing was not done with exotic tools. It was done with systems: shootings by organized units, starvation by policy, exhaustion by forced labor, and gassing by facility design. The myth of piano wire is appealing because it makes evil feel personal, like a villain's signature. But the reality is colder. The signature was administration. Here's the part people miss. When the state chooses a killing method, it's choosing what kind of state it wants to be. A state that kills by courtroom and prison tries to pretend it's legal. A state that kills by secret police tries to pretend it's necessary. A state that kills by theater tries to pretend it's strong. And after the 20th of July, Hitler needed to look strong more than he needed to look legal. So, yes, the conspirators' deaths were shaped by revenge and message, not by neutral procedure. But no, piano wire is not the right way to understand it because it points your attention to the wrong variable. The variable is constraint. Because Hitler wanted humiliation, they were forced to use slow-hanging techniques rather than quick, dignified executions. Because they wanted repeatability inside a prison, they were forced to use infrastructure methods, not hand-to-hand strangling. Because they wanted the story to spread inside the elite, they were forced to make it memorable whether or not the exact material was wire. Now we can answer the question cleanly. Did Hitler use piano wire to execute people during World War II? If what you mean is, did Hitler's regime execute people in a slow, humiliating way after the bomb plot, the answer is yes. If what you mean is, was piano wire itself a standard, repeated execution tool used by Hitler's system, the answer is no, not as a normal method. The system's execution reality was hanging, beheading, shooting, and mass murder by industrial policy, with piano wire functioning more like a myth label than a method category. And that brings us back to the opening image, the hook, the struggling legs, the camera, the dictator's need for proof. The point of that scene was never the wire. The point was the message. The state can reduce even decorated officers to bodies on hooks, and it can do it on schedule. So if you were in that position, which would you pick? Do you pick the dramatic, intimate tool that kills one person slowly, or the boring, repeatable procedure that can kill thousands with administrative efficiency? Drop your answer in the comments. If you want history that connects economics, strategy, and logistics to outcomes, subscribe. Thanks for watching.